All right. So financial planning. Whole goal of it is to basically come up with something that will maximize the value of the firm, right? Maximize the value of the operations of the firm, since that's where the value of a firm comes from, is its operations, of course. We've already hammered this in 10,000 times. I'm almost afraid to go check if anyone got this question wrong on the exam. I think it would hurt my heart, sorry, to see that. But of course, we just know we're trying to find that present value of all the future free cash flows, and we're going to discount back at WACC, right? This is also basically the same thing as leading us to calculate the intrinsic value of a firm, right? Where we take the estimated value of our operations in the future, we take the amount or the basic structure of our capital structure, right? How we raise funds. So it says our short-term investments, our debt, and our preferred stock. Probably should also say common stock there too. Probably just a typo. And then we apply that to our number of common shares. And that should lead us to oops, I didn't plug in my pen. Sorry. Gotta resync it. Right? We combine all that information to figure out the value of the firm, divide it by the number of common shares, and that should get us an estimated share price, right? And if the market's in equilibrium, that share price would be the intrinsic value, which would be equal to the market price if we were in equilibrium. So it says basic steps: create a detailed model to examine current and recent historical data, aka set up some financial statements. And then it says choose a forecasting framework. So kind of like what method do you want to use, sort of thing. So that's kind of where we're going there. The book goes into this whole narrative about, they just hired a new CEO or CFO, and this is the same firm basically that we were working with in chapters 6 and 7, that this firm was having some trouble, right? They were doing fine. And what was, I think in 2018, I think was the year where it went down. All of a sudden it went down, right? So a new CEO is brought in. They're like, hey, let's fix this. So CEO is going to come in, make a model, and then, put that into the forecasting framework of their choice and come up with what's called, if you ever get confused, pro forma financial statements. It's the same thing as projected or forecasted, right? It's all like interchangeable words that you can use, right? Come up with some forecasted financial statements. So again, that we can choose the best operating plan to hopefully maximize the value of the firm and not get fired like the last CEO. And so this is the same data that we were working with before. It was 2018, to where, notice it's that same. Like they had sales level of 5,000. They had cash on hand of 50 at the time. We saw they had increased their debt load for sure over that time period. They had an expansion in inventory. They had a slight expansion in property, plant, and equipment. Right, so this firm was trying to grow. But basically what you should have taken away from chapter 6 is they weren't generating enough sales. Right, like they bought all the assets, they raised the capital to grow, and crickets, right? The growth didn't happen. So same firm as before, so same financial statement as before. If you remember, they financed with all three sources, debt, both short and long term, common stock, and they even had preferred stock. So that's where all the data is coming from. And if you're following along in the Excel sheet, this is like around line 11 is where it starts, row 11. Sorry. All right, so what do we start with? Well, we got to start with some inputs, right? Like I got to start with like getting some inputs to put into my different scenarios. And so this is basically, if you see there, it starts actually on line about 59 or so. Is where this next table starts. That we need to have some inputs, right, into our model. We got to make some assumptions. Hopefully best guesses, not just wild guesses kind of thing. So what we have here is they estimated a sales growth rate, cost of goods sold as a percentage of sales, depreciation as a percentage of net property, plant, and equipment, other operating costs as a percent of sales. Notice all of this is as a percent of sales, right? The amount of cash on hand as a percent of sales, accounts receivable, inventory, net PPE, accounts payable, accruals, and then, the tax rate, just tax rate. All right. What they did in column B is they quoted the actual industry data for 2018 for all those different categories. So, let's at least compare ourselves to the industry to see how on or off we are. And then they went back to their own historical financial statements right there in column C and D for 2007 and 2018. And they looked at their actual numbers for those different categories, right? So let's go look at some historical data. And again, this is all as a percent of sales. So just think of all your basic balance sheet accounts as a percent of sales is what C and D are. And then what we have here is they're going to actually go out and project for 5 years here. So 2019 all the way to 2023. And notice that most of the numbers remain the same. And so what they did is that they made the assumption that they expect their historical ratios, I guess, to stay the same in terms of what their cash looks like compared to sales typically, what their inventory looks like compared to sales, right? And so if you notice for most of this, I'll kind of use a different color here, although it's not that different. It stays the same. And so that is just all based off of these 2018 numbers, right? They're like, hey, this is what our ratio was in 2018. It's probably what it's going to be over the next 5 years too. The only one they didn't do that for, notice, is for sales. They assumed that sales was going to grow in 2019 by 10%, and then it was going to level back off. So we get 10% growth, 8%, 7%, and then it levels off to 5%, kind of like a long-term growth rate. And then it would make sense that all these other variables would change based on that, right? So if my sales increase by 10%, I'm going to need 20% of those sales as inventory. I need my inventory to increase by 20% of the sales increase. But at least I don't have to go out and explicitly forecast inventory, right? If everything's just based off of sales, all I have to do is get a good sales growth estimate and everything else kind of falls into place. It's kind of clever. It's efficient. So that's this first panel up here. In panel 2 down here, they give you some information about capital structure. So same thing. Here's the actual industry data. Here's the actual data for the company for 2017 and 2018 in column C and D. And then basically, they have their target here for the weights of the capital sources, basically. So their percentage of long-term, short-term debt, preferred stock, and common, right? So we can see they're definitely not on their target right now. They definitely picked up way too much debt in 2018 to be anywhere near their target weight there of 28% and a common stock weight of 67%. But they assume that that's what they want to be at and that that's going to remain basically constant over 5 years. Then we have our third section down here, our cost of capital section. So we have basically, that would be your cost of debt, cost of preferred stock, and cost of common stock. Things that we're going to ultimately use to calculate the cost of capital. And once again, they just play the same game that whatever we had previously, we expect the same thing to go forward and to basically stay constant. Last section down there is their target dividend policy. So once again, their actual amounts for 2017, 2018, 11 and 4% respectively. And they have a target of 5% dividend growth year after year. And so that's going to be their status quo scenario. right? If we don't change anything, this is what we expect to happen. What we see is that we're going to have some other scenarios also. But we will do that part in the next video because I have a feeling this one's getting a little long.